Good afternoon, and we're coming on the air because of an awful scene playing out today in Texas. An active shooter for a time at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. This is about 80 miles outside of San Antonio. There is word potentially multiple children have been killed. This happened at the Robb Elementary School in the Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District. The alleged gunman opening fire off campus, then reportedly running into the school, barricading himself in a classroom where it's believed the shooting continued, the school on lockdown. Uvalde Memorial Hospital confirming at this hour 13 children arriving at the ER. That hospital also confirming to ABC News at least 2 children killed. But sources telling us at this hour this number could be far worse. I want to bring in investigative reporter Aaron Kotursky as we look at aerials coming in from the scene. Again, Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. This is about 80 miles or so, perhaps a little longer the distance, but outside San Antonio, Texas. Reports that some have been brought to San Antonio as well. And again, one hospital already confirming 2 children dead. And Aaron, we're learning from sources at this hour that this is sadly going to likely be much worse here.
It does seem that way, David. Multiple law enforcement sources tell ABC News that potentially 14 people have been killed in this shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. That does include the suspect, we're told from multiple law enforcement sources, an 18-year-old suspected shooter killed as this shooting scene unfolded. Law enforcement sources have been trying to nail down specifically the numbers that they're working with. It is still an active scene, as you can see there. So many people gathered round to try and figure out what happened, taping off the areas that were the scene of this shooting. But multiple law enforcement sources tell ABC News, David, that potentially as many as 14 people, including a number of children, have been killed today at the school.
Chilling to hear that number, obviously in a time when we've been reporting on shootings on the rise in this country. Aaron, what more do we know about the scene as it unfolded? Initially, reports had come in that the shooting began off campus, then the shooter reportedly going into that school. Do we know anything more about where the children might have been targeted, whether or not inside the school or outside before that shooter made it indoors?
Nothing confirmed, David, and law enforcement sources say they are still trying to piece together exactly how all of this unfolded. They've focused on the suspected shooter, an 18-year-old who is, according to multiple sources, dead there at the scene after some kind of involvement with law enforcement. We also hear that at least one law enforcement officer may be among those shot, although the condition is not exactly clear. How this unfolded, whether it took place inside, outside, law enforcement sources say they are still trying to piece together, but the ATF, the FBI, and a number of agencies in Texas have all responded to the scene, David.
And of course, you can see significant law enforcement presence on the scene already in Uvalde, Texas. Outside both Austin and San Antonio, of course. The reason we bring up San Antonio is because there are reports some have been brought to San Antonio for medical help. And again, as I mentioned when we came on the air, Uvalde Memorial Hospital reporting at least 2 children dead. And as you heard our investigative reporter Aaron Kotursky just report, sources now telling ABC News that as many as 14 people, including children, could have been killed here this afternoon in Uvalde, Texas, at yet another shooting in this country. ABC's Maria Villarreal is our reporter in Texas, and Maria knows this community. Maria is with us on the phone, and can you just describe to us, I understand this is a rural community, a close-knit community, a relatively small one.
David, that's exactly right. I mean, this community is about an hour and a half or so outside of San Antonio, Texas. They have less than 20,000 people living in the area, and they are a farming and ranching community. We were just there not too long ago covering some border issues. The mayor in the town telling us over the last 2 months they have been wrestling with a lot of immigration issues, but more importantly, just describing really the community essence of his town, talking about how they are so close-knit, so tight-knit. We are about 30 minutes away from Uvalde right now, and on our road trip down there, we have seen a number of law enforcement agencies driving down there extremely fast. We know that the local sheriff's department in San Antonio, Bexar County, as well as the San Antonio Police Department, they are also responding to this area. One thing to note, you just mentioned right now that there are a number of of potential victims that are being taken to the San Antonio area. And that's because, this town is so small and their hospital is so small that a incident of this magnitude, what we're talking about, there is no way this hospital could respond to this. I was in touch with the mayor's office. They do tell me right now that this is a very flexible, very fluid situation, but they are trying to get in touch with as many parents as quickly as they can. We do know that the children that were evacuated from this elementary school were taken to a local civic center so their parents could pick them up. But this is just a very scary situation. As anybody knows that has covered this kind of stuff, and still a lot of details coming in as we continue to get down there.
You've been listening to Maria Villarreal, our correspondent based in Texas. She's on her way to the scene, and she's already talked with sources in that community who have now the difficult task, as they so often do when there are shootings across this country, of reaching out to inform parents in that community of just the horrific scene that's played out in Uvalde, Texas this afternoon, certainly before they can confirm to any reporter on the scene or certainly on the national level what the actual numbers are. Again, we're on the air at this hour with our breaking news coverage of yet another school shooting in this country in Uvalde, Texas, at the Robb Elementary School. It's believed the hospital there in Uvalde reporting at least 2 children dead, and sources now telling ABC's Aaron Katersky, among others in our news division, that number could actually be far worse when authorities are finally able to confirm in front of the cameras what's played out today. Early reports, as many as 14 dead, and of course that number would include more children than initially reported by that hospital. I want to bring in Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice correspondent who covers the FBI and law enforcement in this country. And Pierre, I know they're already working this case.
They are indeed, David. And to be clear, my sources are describing a gruesome scene at that school. They are aware of some of the numbers, including the number 14 that Aaron just reported. Sources saying they're being careful because the situation is so confusing and so gruesome. But make no mistake, they are describing multiple dead at that school. They are telling me that the highest levels of federal law enforcement are being briefed on it as we speak. I was just with the Attorney General at a press conference a few moments ago. He acknowledged that he was being briefed on the situation right before the press conference. He was seeking additional information. So literally the information is flowing. It's a very small community. They're trying to get details from a obviously overwhelmed small police department. But again, the details that we have, multiple dead. Again, a number of numbers are being floated around in terms of the number of dead. Sources saying be careful with the numbers, in fact, because it's such a confusing situation. However, they're making clear that we should get people there as soon as possible because this is not going to be anything but an ugly scene that has been playing out over and over again. I cannot tell you how depressed and sad some of these law enforcement officials are that are contacting us, David.
I think the country shares that sentiment with them. Pierre, just 10 days ago, you and I were in Buffalo reporting on the awful shooting in Buffalo, New York. Just 9 days ago, our team in California reporting from Laguna Woods, the gunman who walked into a church there. Now our team on the way to Uvalde, Texas, where again this afternoon, another school shooting in this country. As Pierre just reported, law enforcement telling our team, and I'm sure many others, that this is going to be yet another horrific scene in this country. Again, the hospital in that very small community confirming to ABC News that several people were brought to that hospital for help. The hospital reporting at least 2 children dead, which is an awful number in and of itself. Then sources reporting that the number could actually be far higher when we get a clearer picture of what's playing out in this community. FBI and federal sources telling Pierre Thomas simply that this is going to be a horrific scene when it's all said and done. We do know that authorities in that community plan to brief reporters at some time in the near future. Of course, we'll bring that to you as soon as we have it. In the meantime, I want to bring in Elizabeth Newman, formerly with the Department of Homeland Security. And Elizabeth, you don't need me to tell you that this has been a problem for many years in this country, and particularly in these last couple of weeks. Authorities have been warning that this could get even worse.
That's right, David. We've sadly been expecting more of these types of attacks But it really is gut-wrenching when it's an elementary school. It reminds us of Newtown in December of 2012 when another elementary school was hit. And there just are no words. We have got to figure out a way to be able to identify individuals that are showing signs and indications that they want to commit acts of violence, and we have to find a way to start to prevent this. It is just an epidemic of violence that we have seen at historic levels for the last 5 years, and it looks, by all indications, to be another horrid year, possibly likely to break records with the number of active shooters and the number of incidents of violence in this country.
Our thanks to you. I want to go back to Aaron Katursky, who is just reporting in more information from his sources. Aaron, what are you learning?
David, initially reported as taking place outside the school, ABC News has now been told by multiple law enforcement sources that there was gunfire inside this school, Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas, by a gunman who is, according to these sources, dead, an 18-year-old male that came into that school with an unknown firearm or firearms, and authorities are now exploring what his connection might have been to that school. They're not exactly certain. They are working with a name, and they are now also scouring social media, looking for any background and any connections that he may have with any other people. But at the moment, authorities are of the belief that even though this was initially reported to have taken place outside the school, there was gunfire inside the school with multiple dead, including, sadly, David, a number of children.
Aaron Katursky reporting that the suspect, they have a name, they're working the case at potential contacts to the school. And for those of you who have been watching from the beginning, one of my questions early on was whether or not this played out inside the school or outside. Early reports had been that this was off campus. Aaron Katursky now reporting that it was inside that school, which obviously makes more sense given the scope of this tragedy unfolding before our eyes here late this afternoon. Again, Uvalde, Texas, you can see law enforcement on the scene. It's been growing since we've been on the air. Robb Elementary School, reports of a young gunman going into that school and opening fire. Reports, sources telling ABC News, and this number is a difficult number to report this afternoon, but that as many as 14 could be dead, and that would include several children. We do know that the Uvalde Memorial Hospital, which is in that very small rural community, has reported to ABC News that at least 2 children have died, either upon arrival or since arriving at that hospital. So we know that particular number, but authorities have been telling us this afternoon that the number will likely get far worse. I want to bring in Brad Garrett, longtime ABC News contributor, formerly with the FBI. And Brad, you know, we've been on the air far too many times with stories like these. We heard Elizabeth say earlier that authorities had been warning that the number of cases like this one could sadly rise over the course of the coming months, and we have seen just a stunning couple of weeks in this country.
So, David, you have to look at this from the side that these are almost impossible to stop unless you have, as Elizabeth said, some advanced information. The number of firearms, the number of the millions of AR-type weapons, we don't know if that was used, but something like that perhaps today. Elementary schools typically do not have security because they typically don't need it. And so the combination of maybe no officer there, a person with overwhelming firepower, probably had to go through very little security. And think about Buffalo, as you mentioned. Shooter started outside, shot people outside the school, then shot his way in. Perhaps you have the same version here. But to not repeat myself, we are at the mercy of what we know about people in advance. And without that, there is no realistic way to stop these.
Brad Garrett with us as we continue to follow this as well. Brad, thank you. And we'll come back to you if needed along the way here, certainly. And again, we're expecting to hear from authorities there on the scene a short time from now. And of course, we'll be back on the air when that happens so that you can get a clearer portrait, a clearer picture of what's playing out in Uvalde, Texas. What we do know, before I send many of you to your local news, is that there has been a school shooting at Robb Elementary School there in Uvalde, Texas, about 80 miles outside of San Antonio. The hospital there in that very small rural community already confirming at least 2 children dead. Sources telling ABC News that that number will likely grow far higher once they come before the camera a short time from now. We'll continue our coverage on ABC News Live and on abcnews.com. We'll be right back on the air as soon as authorities come to the cameras. And of course, I'll be back with the entire team for World News Tonight. In the meantime, for many of you, it's your local news. I'm David Muir in New York. We'll see you shortly.